Jake, how's my hair?
The requirement for this is a lack of hair on top.
Two bald guys talking about energy.
Hi, my name is Dan Pickering. I'm the Chief Investment Officer of Pickering Energy Partners.
I'm Scott Gale. I'm the Executive Director of Investments and External Engagements with Halliburton Labs. All right, Dan Pickering, thrilled to have you here. Welcome to Halliburton's global headquarters, our campus here in the north part of Houston. Excited to have you here and talking with Jake and Colin and the team. We're gonna thinking about having a conversation about predicting the future. What does a successful energy transition look like? So really excited to have the discussion and get your perspective and just start the conversation. So I guess to tee things off, what do we think a successful energy transition looks like? What are some of the components of that?
I should say up front that you and I haven't prepped any of these questions, so this is going to be a free-flowing discussion, and it's a really big, broad, overarching question. Success of the energy transition. I think you got to define it first. What is the energy transition? And I think ultimately it's going to mean something different for everybody. From my perspective, I think energy transition means lower carbon. I think success is going to mean we do wind up with a lower carbon world. I think success is going to mean profitability, because this cannot be something that's sponsored by governments and paid for by individuals over time. So it's got to be profitable, and I think that it's got to be something that is not just a flash in a pan. I think it's got to be something sustainable, sort of a play on words there, I guess. But so I think it actually has to work. It's got to be profitable, and it has to be something that's in place for a long period of time, because if this is a flash in the pan, it will be far from a success.
Yeah, you said something there that I think is really important. One of the components, I think, is just around getting to a place where we have common metrics, where we're measuring the right things, whether that's carbon impact, whether that's consumer behaviors being tied to some type of environmental impact, but that all energy sources, distribution, grid scale, storage, all these things are sort of looked at through a common scoring metric of sorts. It seems like we're in the early days of that starting to come together, and there seems to be some challenges of looking from an engineering perspective, the black box of just ins and outs. In many cases, with some renewable sources or other things, we're looking at just the output and not thinking too heavily about the input and the things that are contributing to that. So it's a bit more of a holistic, like maybe cradle to grave perspective on all of the things, to be clear about what it is that we're really solving for.
Sure. And so you asked me the question, success. What do you think success for the energy transition is going to be defined as?
Yeah, I think it's certainly going to be an evolution, and it is going to take time. And so I think part of success needs to be defined on what time scale. And so what does success 5 years from now look like? What does success 50 years from now look like? And so I do think that in the near term, there is going to be a bit of a land rush, land grab to get involved with, I think, the nearest adjacencies in energy transition. And so I think a lot of that are areas that the incumbent energy sector has already been thinking a lot about, from carbon capture, utilization, storage, how to handle the carbon, and in what forms, I think is an interesting challenge that needs to be solved, that there's some near-term line of sight about what that's looking like. I think the hydrogen economy is another big one, because it fits the right kind of structure for what we're used to doing as sort of an incumbent industry. There's a lot of, obviously, battery technology and things that are coming together. So I think there are a number of areas that are, I think, going to be explored. What I think will be interesting to see play out is on that much longer time horizon, decades out, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, is hopefully the dust will start to settle on the metrics that you've described. Is it economically effective? Is it cost effective for the consumer? Is it safe, reliable, sustainable, consistent? And so the winners and losers will start to settle out, I think, over time. And not to pick on, I was just reading, it came out earlier last year, a discussion about a big concentrated solar power plant out in the state of California. And we were having some conversations just yesterday about just about $3 billion was plowed into this project using molten salt to sort of capture thermal energy from a concentrated solar plant, and plagued by a number of issues, and ultimately has been idled and shut down for now. And when I heard that story, again, it was sort of when the news first broke, but we were kind of debating through it in a conversation yesterday. And there's going to be a lot of examples of that, of sort of the discard pile of things that technically sounded interesting, but for whatever reason could not sustain not only the installation of it, but then the maintenance of those things. And there's that long-term, that levelized cost over time, I think is a component that longer term, we start to get better visibility of where the winners and losers really are. And so I think those are a few components that play into it and that have to be considered. But I agree, I think one of the pieces that I think about, particularly related to energy and longer term and success, is frankly, the whole goal of energy is to improve quality of life for humans on this planet. And that has been, if you dig back into the history of sort of electricity and the different forms of power and light and all the things that humans have had to deal with, there's still roughly 2 billion people on the planet, plus that are using biomass for their primary fuel source. They're burning wood chips and animal dung. And I think we've got to be really clear about, when we're talking about energy generally, that's not just frankly, it's not just a first world problem. It's a global challenge and a global problem. And that plays such an important role in the affordability of electricity and what that means to quality of life. And so I think we have to be mindful of that entire equation as we're digging in and solving for these various problems. And so I think it's going to be a fascinating mosaic of a lot of different things. Maybe we could dig into a couple of those, but those are a few of the thoughts that I have about what success looks like.
You make a lot of great points. It's early in this process. You talked about decades. I think that's probably an underappreciated element of this story. It's sort of my soapbox issue, which is the time associated with getting to where people, broadly defined, the world wants to be from an energy transition perspective. It's going to take a long time. People want everything today. It's not going to happen today. You got to start today. But that, I think, is going to be part of the challenge for the oil and gas industry, a part of the challenge for all of the energy transition companies, is helping people understand that this is a process. And so I think that's, like I said, my soapbox issue is we're going to have to see right now. I think I'm disappointed that people feel like it's an either or. Hydrocarbons are bad, or energy transition's good, or low carbon's good, or the oil and gas guys hate the windmill guys and the windmill guys hate the oil and gas guys. We're going to have to live together for a long period of time. And I think that will become apparent as we move through this process, but it's going to take a little bit of time. I'm going to ask one more question based on your comment about incumbents. And so one of the things that I find interesting is, as folks in the traditional hydrocarbon business think about what energy transition means, I look out at other industries, and Ford didn't disrupt autos, it was Tesla that did it. And Sears didn't disrupt retail, it was Amazon that did it. And so we're sitting here talking about the incumbents in the business. Are they going to be meaningful players in the energy transition, or is it going to be a bunch of new people with new ideas that sort of come in and capture that prize?
I think it's a fascinating thing to consider, particularly when you look back in history and what disruption and the pace of disruption has looked like.
Yep.
And there are you've referenced too, there are a number of examples of when you look back across how the Fortune 500 has fared, and if we were to look just the turnover in the Fortune 500, sure, and the names that are still around, you're exactly right. That should be the question. It's a very introspective question that everybody in the oil and gas sector should be thinking about. And it raises the question of sort of, where is that disruption going to come from? Where is that innovation going to come from? And that's certainly something that we wrestle with a lot, particularly through the lens of Halliburton Labs, is thinking about the startup community.
Yeah.
Frankly, a lot of the ideas that are going to be needed and that are going to take shape come from early stage companies. And I think that creates a really fascinating opportunity sort of more broadly for the incumbent players when you think about the resources that are at their disposal to be able to engage with that community is, I think, a unique challenge. And so you really do have to dig into sort of innovation. Where does it come from? The culture of innovation. Where did ideas sort of start, and what are the components that are needed to kind of make that happen? And so I think that that's really important, particularly not only for the city of Houston that has the ambition of being kind of the incumbent energy capital of the world, but to become the energy transition capital of the world. They're not the only city that's vying for that that position, but we're in the pole position as a city and have some really unique capabilities as I look around. Think about the engineering and science disciplines and the capabilities that are here. We have all the right components to be able to go and do that. But I think it's a question of, and I don't want to be critical of the incumbent sectors focus on their own research or other things, and because I think a lot of that's going to happen. But it's this balance of how do you get to new, novel, creative ideas, and then how do you bridge that to that taking place at a scale that is impactful? Because having a single successful demonstration pilot isn't going to shift the tide in any of the things that we're talking about. You mentioned Tesla. Tesla's disrupting a lot of the energy transition space, but we're going to need like a Tesla a year for the next 20, 30 years to be able to get to a future state where I don't know if we'll ever call it sort of finished, like, hey, the energy transition, we look in the rearview mirror and saying, well, we did a good job, we transitioned, and I think there's this constant evolution that's happening. But a few thoughts around that I think are important. So we could dig into maybe whether we want to take it to a conversation around the components of what a successful startup community looks like and what's needed. Also happy to unpack some of the Halliburton Labs perspective on sort of how at least we think of that. But I do think that the names and the players in the future state, pick your time frame, will be different than what it is today. I do think that there has to be. I mean, it's going to be really fascinating to see how that takes shape.
I'm intrigued to see if the traditional energy companies can nurture the new stuff and have that maintain and be a part of the existing businesses, or if they've got to get to a point where they have to be spun out to be successful, whether that's to capture capital, external capital, or just to, again, break the mold, do things differently, think differently, and that may require a different corporate structure. So it'll be interesting to see. I do think that you said it's the incumbent's game to lose. Maybe. We're going to have to see. I watch with interest, BP, that's taking a dramatic shift in where they're going to spend their money, compared to an Exxon that's much more conservative about the magnitude of their spending on non-oil and gas type of efforts. And so I don't know who's right. You mentioned a lot of money is going to get spent. You mentioned a project where $3 billion went down the drain. I think if we look back at the history of big changes, capital rushes in. It's wildly successful in a pyramid type way, and down at the base of the pyramid there are a bunch of folks who lose a bunch of money. And I think it's too early to know who those players are going to be. Everybody thinks their project's great or their strategy's great. History says not everybody spends money wisely when they're in a gold rush environment. And I agree with you, that's the mentality that we're in right now. It's fueled a little bit by government, a little bit, but I think what's interesting to me, the groundswell, right? This is not, the corporations and individuals are so far ahead of governments right now. Amazon and Walmart and all of the consumer-facing companies are doing things way, way ahead of what regulations would require because they think it's the right thing to do. Investors, same story. Investors are way ahead of regulations. They're pushing ESG and lower carbon at a pace that's much faster than they quote unquote have to. And so when you've got popular opinion and money both telling you the same thing, I think business job is to listen. They're listening and they're coming in guns blazing with a lot of dollars. So, that, I don't know how it's all going to work out. I do think that every project's not going to be a good project. And in fact, most projects, the second owner of some of these things may be the better owner or the third owner. We've seen that historically, but I'm impressed by the amount of money that's coming into the space. And I actually think, one of the things I wrote down as we were prepping for this discussion was valuation, and are we in a bubble on valuation? And you guys at Halliburton Labs, you're starting companies, you've got to value them. Money's coming into them. That has to have a price or a cost or a value. So how are you valuing companies when either the revenue's a long way away or there is no revenue or it's an idea? So how do you think about valuation and value and that process?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, as we look out across the landscape, for us, our scope and remit is around power generation, distribution, so kind of greening the grid kinds of activities, including grid scale energy storage, energy conservation, and we're even looking at sort of waste to value or circular economy kinds of applications, and primarily looking for those companies that are at that kind of inflection point where they've got the science is more or less settled, and they're looking to sort of take that technology then to scale.
So not an experiment.
Not an experiment. It's not an idea on the back of a napkin. I like to say they're not going from 0 to 1, but they're going from 1 to 10 or 10 to 100. And at that point, it becomes an engineering challenge and less so a scientific challenge. And so how do you then engineer to go from making 5 liters of this thing on a bench top to 5,000 liters a week, or one demonstration pilot to making 100 of them a year kind of thing? And those are a different set of issues and challenges. So we look at valuation a bit through that lens, particularly for early stage companies that have not achieved first revenue yet. There's certainly not an EBITDA. There's not, they've maybe not even raised their first round of institutional financing. And so part of it is we ask ourselves the question, let's just assume that everything that you're proclaiming as a startup comes to fruition, then what? What's the next thing that you need to be able to go do to be able to take that to scale? And we look at it a bit through that lens. I'm simplifying that, but saying, okay, let's just say that it works. What are all the things that is going to need to happen? Who's going to be the early adopters? What's the value chain going to look like? Are you in a position to capture the value that you're creating? And looking at sort of that future state, and you have certainly predictions around that, and you have to make assumptions, but a lot of it is rooted in the likelihood of that technology first working. But then I like to think of that technology is not inserting itself onto a blank sheet of paper. It's going to share a fence line, so to speak, with other technologies. How is that going to be incorporated? And what's the reaction going to be? And oftentimes we run into technology that's like, this is great. If it works, you need these 7 other things to work for your thing to really take off. Can you control those 7 other things? If not, then let's have a conversation about either how you engineer around those 7 other things, or how do you partner with one of those 7 other things. I'm just using sort of broadly an example. But that then leads us to, okay, what's the likelihood that this thing really can take off, and identifying those commercial and technical risks to the extent that we can. And frankly, revenue is important and EBITDA is important because it's an indicator of interest. Obviously, if you're separating somebody from their money, the customer is there's a buyer, but sometimes it might not be the right buyer. You've got to really understand kind of what it is that you're solving for. And so we have a lot of those discussions throughout kind of our diligence process, but it's a big challenge. And frankly, I think one of the components, particularly as we talk about incumbents, and particularly publicly traded incumbents, or even those that have, investor expectations and things, you get into a cadence and a rhythm of you invest in ways and in things that you have line of sight to return. And that just makes good business sense, whether it's a model or whether, that mentality is. As you get into earlier stage investing, you don't have line of sight to that return. And frankly, as you start to contribute to the startup community more broadly, whether that's in the form of being an advisor or a mentor or other activities, that's something that you maybe don't have line of sight to. And that's a bit of the lens that we think about it at Halliburton Labs is, we've got the ambition to support something like 15 companies a year. When we do that for 5 years, we've spent 12 months with 75 different companies that are on the leading edge of all these different areas. Not every one of them is going to be successful, but that gives us sort of a front row seat to kind of see how things are evolving and changing. And so I think for us, by putting time, effort, resources into that, we don't know which of those companies is going to be successful. I don't have direct line of sight to exactly what the outcomes are going to be, but we know that by contributing into that, we will benefit on the back end in some form or fashion, whether that's better de-risking knowledge and understanding of where the market's evolved to. And like you said, the second owner, we might support a company that ultimately fails, but then another one comes along that's able to solve problems 4, 5, and 6. And now we're prepared and ready to think about it that way. So I think that line of sight to outcome is one of those difficulties that kind of the incumbent players have to get over to be able to say, I'm going to put time, effort, and resources into the startup community. Maybe that's direct investment. Maybe that's supporting through providing opportunities for demonstration pilots or whatever that might be. And by doing so, I will derive some benefit. That's a difficult conversation to have when you're vying for scarce resources. And so it's a unique challenge, particularly relative to other investment decisions that I think happen.
So portfolio effect really does help in that process.
I think so. You talked a little bit about kind of the sentiment of kind of an us versus them mentality, and to the extent that it's useful, maybe we can kind of dig in. We just came out of this big weather event here in the Texas area. California had theirs kind of in the summer. So what I found was really interesting in sort of looking through social media and kind of the response to that is everybody looks at the same event and they come back with a reinforced opinion about the side of the fence that they're sitting on. And I find that dynamic really fascinating, is that there's not a way to convert somebody who's really passionate about renewables to say that I think Alex Epstein calls them the reliables,
Yes.
The thermal generating kind of power gen. And you don't see a lot of people sort of saying like, yeah, you know what, I'm an oil and gas fan, even though I've been into solar for the last, there's not a lot of conversion. What I am seeing is sort of this coming to a middle state of saying, hey, whether I'm incumbent oil and gas, I can see the value of what renewables might be able to bring. Or even though I'm really passionate about, I don't know, pick one, hydroelectric or solar or something that I think is more on the renewable side, that starting to see the benefit of what a natural gas-fired power plant might do to the overall grid. There's a lot of interesting conversation about nuclear and small nuclear reactors. There's obviously discussion happening around fission and kind of other opportunities in the nuclear umbrella. And so I'm just sort of curious, especially in kind of the current administration and where the resources are going to come from, like what's going to bring kind of these two camps together? Because I think we agree that it's not going to be success in energy transition isn't that one reached the top of the hill first and the other rode off into the sunset. There will be a place for both in that future state. How do we bridge that more effectively? What are some of the things that we can drive some commonality around?
It's a great question. I can tell you from my view of the oil and gas sector is they're coming to the middle, if you will, or if we view the oil and gas camp over here and the renewables camp or energy transition camp over here, the middle, right? The middle is driven, I think, by different issues. The guys in the oil and gas camp say, seems like the tipping point has arrived, and sooner or later, we're going to have to come this way because demand for what I'm doing is going to eventually ebb. You look at Aramco today, I think one of the challenges that corporations have is that their CEO's in the seat for 5 years or 10 years or something like that and retires typically. If you look at Saudi, they got a guy that's 30-something, could be in the seat for 50 years. So he's literally going to oversee this energy transition issue. And so you got a guy that's got the biggest set of resources with a really long runway saying, I'd better do something. And he's creating, Neon or whatever the name of the city is, and he's selling part of his oil and gas company, right? Aramco's now partially public. So you look at that, and I think necessity over a period of time pushes the oil and gas guys to the middle. And money and availability of capital is dragging them that way as well, and that's the ESG kind of concept. On the transition side of things, I think they come to the middle because, like we just went through here in Texas, you take a hit to your reputation when your cool thing, your wind power, doesn't work. Now, by the way, oil and gas didn't work either, so
right.
To be fair.
But we would have been much worse if one did not exist or the other did not exist.
That's right. And so I think these guys come more toward the center, the renewables camp, because you can't get there immediately. And so you've got to come toward the middle. If you want your thing to continue to gain steam, you've got to be realistic about how long that's going to take. And you can't look over here and say, this is terrible. I get it, the environmentalists do. So if you look at the Greta Thunbergs of the world, that's a religious thing, and in religion there is no room for another viewpoint. I think in business and in practicality, there's always room for another viewpoint. You have to think about sort of the totality of the situation. And Greta's worried we're all going to die, I guess. She can't come off of that, but the reality is everybody's going to have to squeeze to the middle because you can't get to that lower carbon future immediately, which is why that timing issue is my big soapbox issue. You have to be realistic about how long this takes, and I think that's what pulls everybody sort of to more common ground, which is we are going to have to work together. And I also think the more companies that have a foot in both worlds, that will also, you will stop demonizing a little bit some of the hydrocarbon guys because they're also going to, enter the camp of the good guys. They're going to be doing more stuff that the world wants. So I think it's just going to take time.
I think it's interesting, we think about energy density being sort of like a really key sort of fundamental ingredient here, that when we talk about common metrics and we look at sort of, and I think that's why nuclear is starting to come back into the discussion a little bit. I heard Bill Gates yesterday kind of talking about in promoting his new book, that we can't ignore nuclear because there's really nothing else that humans have invented to generate power that is more effective at doing it as efficiently as nuclear. And so I continue to think there's a fascinating track around that. It comes with a lot of baggage. There's a lot of things that have to be solved for, but I think they are solvable. But I think something that's driving that unity in the middle is that recognition that there are resources that have to be mined or consumed or recycled to be able to get to the power gen at scale across the entire system that's going to be needed. Power demand, I think, I was looking at I think it was maybe Bloomberg or Goldman Sachs or somebody sort of put out like a power demand forecast like 10 years ago, and they were off by like 50%. Like power demand there was sort of an assumption that like the digitalization of things was going to reduce power demand, but then they sort of didn't account for server farms and Bitcoin mining and all these things. And so power demand is continued to go up. And so on that trajectory, I think everybody's seeing that impact. And I think what's really just fascinating in the last 12 months to see the event in California. If we pick on California for a second, there's many that sort of fit into that, renewables only camp. And you see the event that happened in Texas, where many are rooted in the thermal or oil and gas or reliable kind of camp. And it's just ironic that one experience in the summer, one experience in the winter. And so I think that there's maybe potentially an inflection point in the conversation. I think people will retrench and sort of say that it reinforces their own opinion, but my hope is that people will respond in the way that you've described, is to say, let's take a step back and say, okay, if we were to have only one energy source, your favorite one, pick whatever it is, if it's natural gas, if it's nuclear, if it's solar, there are trade-offs to be able to get to the scale that's required. Solar being, it's a very dispersed energy source, and so you have to have a footprint that is significant. And there's a great way to achieve that through residential, through putting it on parking garages and other things. But we also have yet to sort of unpack what are the raw materials that are required to make all these solar panels. What happens, we're just experiencing this now, what happens to solar panels as they age out, as they've been in service for 20 years, 30 years. And you're seeing it in wind. When you look at the landfills that are made up of turbine blades and other things. And so there's a bit of when I say that engineering box, they're sort of looking outwards. Well, I'm looking at a wind turbine that is there and it's generating renewable electricity. But where did all that raw material come from? What is sort of that cradle to grave need there? And so I think what's interesting for those that are in the solar business, they actually don't talk about as much the environmental benefits. We talk about the economics, because the economics of solar have gotten to a point where it's really interesting, particularly at the consumer level. Now, there are people that are buying solar because they ascribe to the religion as you've described it, and that's fine. But it's just interesting to hear those that was listening to Lynn Jurich, who runs Sunrun, who's has the largest market share for residential solar, with Solar City and Tesla sort of second, talk about her business for 30 minutes on a podcast and doesn't talk about what it's doing or not doing for the environment. It's much more around, this is a new energy source, it is economic, and we'll deal with some of the other challenges that are going to come eventually. But I think that realistic conversation about the metrics helps to sort of get to a centralized state.
You bring up a good point around essentially the supply chain. One of the things that we're doing, as a money manager, is thinking about, from an energy transition perspective, it's not all windmills and solar. It's the renewable. It's the rare earth minerals that it takes to create batteries for EVs, or the copper that goes into the whole process, et cetera. And so I think we're still in early ages of defining, who the winners are. And as you said, there'll be winners and losers. But I think the playing field's broader than a windmill or a solar farm or electric vehicle. It's all the components that go into it, and the sexiness of the EV companies or the solar companies or the wind companies. I think you're going to start to find that sexiness creep down into all of the ancillary businesses that go into making those end products. Everybody loves to drive their Tesla, and Tesla's been a fabulous investment. Maybe the investment of the next 5 years is going to be in how you make the Tesla, how you get to the Tesla, how you get to the windmill, or how you get to the solar farm. So I think that we'll see this conversation broaden out over the next 3 or 4 or 5 years. Which brings me to a question that I had for you, which is timing again. So you think about where we are in this conversation of energy transition. Take whatever you think the definition of success or progress is, and it's going to be different for everyone. But How long do you think it's going to take before folks say, wow, we've really made progress? Is that going to be, I don't even want to define the time period. Is it 1 year, 100 years, or how many months, or how long is this going to take?
I think part of the answer to that is rooted in how much disruption do we really want to achieve, and how much innovation do we really want to get through. I think you could sort of pause today and look back and say, hey, you know what, we've made a fair amount of progress. There are conversations that are happening amongst players in the energy space that just were not happening even 18 months ago. And so there's certainly this feeling of an inflection point, and I think it's a question of where do we achieve sort of that point of satisfaction?
Yeah, that's what I was looking for, the point of satisfaction. Where is it, and how long does it take?
I also think it's going to depend on the individual.
Greta's never going to be satisfied.
Exactly.
So take the most people.
Yeah.
You know, take they. When are they going to be satisfied?
I think that it comes down to, I think most people look at sort of to put words to it, sort of a climate crisis, that anytime a weather event takes place, at the consumer level, they are now they're pointing fingers. They want to they want to find sort of the blame.
Yeah.
And
tsunami equals climate problem.
Exactly.
Fires equal climate problem. Yep.
And that simple connectivity, it's rooted in all sorts of challenges and problems. I think the energy equation is one component of it. To sort of sidestep for a second, there's the agricultural component of it is another big contributor. Transportation is actually a relatively small contributor relative to concrete, to steel, to agriculture. And so I think what needs to happen, and I think is starting to happen, is the average consumer starts to change their behaviors based on climate outcomes. And that needs to push back into every facet of human life and impact on the planet, energy being a critical component of it. But there's a lot of the carbon equation that is not generated by the power sector. It's generated by many of these other sectors that all contribute to human quality of life. And so I think we need to get to a place where everybody is operating off of a common set of metrics. We've got clarity across corporations, government, et cetera. Again, that we're clear on what is the problem that we're actually solving. And that's a difficult bipartisan place to get to, because by driving extreme perspectives, that yields outsized investment, that yields constituents, that yields very different things. And so
I guess the Paris Accord could kind of be viewed as that common metric, right? It's like, okay, we've got to keep temperatures from rising, whatever it is, 2 degrees in however many years. But I think you're talking about a more detailed set of metrics than just, hey, we don't want temperatures to go up, correct?
I think in part because it's difficult for me, if I just put on my hat as an average consumer, what is it that I'm doing that leads to this 2 degree metric?
Yep.
And I think it's great to have a metric. It's great to have something to work towards. But I do think that real execution of that, you have to be able to drive the connectivity to it. And that's where I think that granularity becomes really important. Yep. And I don't know if we've fully mapped out sort of the impacts that we're having. And if there is a 2 degree impact, let's say we achieve that goal. Let's say success is we achieve that goal, that we've avoided a climate disaster 50 years from now as measured by a 2 degree change, and that the average temperature in 2070 is plus or minus, a half a degree or the same as it is now, and then so success is sort of achieved. I don't know if we'd be able to look back and be able to pinpoint exactly what contributed to that. And so we have to do something, but that cause and effect, I think, is still being discussed and thought about. There's a lot of math that provides that indication, but a lot of us don't understand statistics really well. A lot of us don't understand cause and effect really well. And so I think it's just a very easy thing to latch onto. And so that's where I look to, okay, what are the real things that we can tangibly do, that we're measuring, that we're having that impact, that in the broad aspect of achieving that outcome, that desirable outcome.
Right. But so I'm back to my question though. Point of satisfaction takes how long?
I don't think
putting
we should,
you on the spot.
I don't think we should ever get to a point of satisfaction.
Okay.
Because I think that the
goalpost
math
will move and
the
that's
math
okay.
will change.
Yeah.
We're solving for 9 billion people on the planet. 50 years from now, we could be solving for 25 billion people on the planet. I don't know. That becomes a very different kind
Right.
of thing to look for.
Right.
So I do think that the goalposts are constantly changing.
Yeah.
And so I think that some level of satisfaction is what has gotten us to this point today. And so I do think that the upcoming generation, as I look at my 4 kids and sort of their thought process and what the things that they're going to solve for, I do think that we're going to see, and maybe just a quick comment on generational connectivity, because I think the pandemic is going to bring a degree of global cohesiveness that we've never seen on the planet. And
Really?
I do.
Because we're all experiencing the same thing
Because we're
at
all
the same time.
Because whether you're sitting in India or Saudi Arabia or Australia or Argentina or Colorado, you are experiencing some form of lockdown, some form of fear related to COVID, some loss of friend or family or whatever that might be. And often those generational inflection points are rooted in that. I looked at my 12-year-old daughter where she sees the fear and the impact on her day-to-day life. That, I believe, if I were to sort of make a prediction, is going to drive a level of global cohesiveness with our social media connectivity, with all of that,
Yep.
that actually has the potential to drive coordinated consumer behavior in a way that we've never been able to achieve before. And that actually sort of brings some degree of hope that like we might be able to get to sort of a state rooted in the average consumer saying, listen, I am not going to, I don't know, pick your favorite sort of thing. Like, I'm not going to use plastic straws anymore, is like an example of like that is a behavior that people believe has a positive impact on the environment. And maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But I think there's something.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that I hadn't thought about. And so it leads me to say, who's going to be the voice? So if you have an opportunity, who's going to be the voice that, whether it's the plastic straw or the 5 things, or who's going to do that? It's probably not going to be a political figure, because those guys are not viewed as particularly inspiring these days. Is it a rich guy like Elon Musk? Do we need Elon Musk saying, here are the 5 things you do to save the planet? Or is it some celebrity? I mean, what do you think? I mean, you're blowing my mind right now.
I think Elon is demonstrating
opportunity.
that.
He's certainly
think
showing he can move markets. Now the question is, can he move behavior? Right? So you can say something and Bitcoin price goes up or down or whatever, but can somebody like that get you to do something different? Can he get you to drive less or to do something, right? I don't know. What do you think?
I think so. I do.
So how are you going to get to Elon to get him? How are you going to give him?
I don't know if it's Elon himself, but I think what we're seeing will have echoes into the future. That 10 years from now, some kid who's 12 years old today is going to have a platform and a perspective and the right talking points to rally a global movement.
Yeah.
I think there's a real possibility for that. Haven't thought about it in this way. I'm crystallizing it as we're having this discussion.
Right. You heard it here, folks.
But the potential for that, the tools for that, the receptiveness for that, I think there's a real possibility that something like that takes place. And frankly, it's probably going to require something like that if we're actually going to make the kinds of changes that are needed. And that's where I think when the environmentalist aspect of it, I grew up in Washington State. I grew up with a lot of flannel and perspectives that I see that and I relate to that. in the sense that they have a sense of urgency.
Yep.
They're saying, we don't have time. And I think that that driving force is an important part of the overall tapestry. It has to be rooted in engineering and science and economics and all these other things. But that sense of urgency, I do think, has the ability to sort of push things.
Typically you need a problem to get a fix. You know, not just a problem, but a problem for a lot of people. So global financial crisis, there was too much debt, and there were lots of people saying, we have too much debt, and you didn't really get the fixes until it all blew up. And so the question is a pandemic enough of a blow up, enough of a problem that everybody says, we got to get a fix? Or do you have to have a widespread climate issue to really get people focused on it? I don't know the answer, but I'm more hopeful thinking about your pandemic as a unifier concept, because that's a much better outcome than burning up half the world. I mean, historically, you bring people together by a bunch of people killing each other in war or something like that, and we've had the deaths without the violence, I guess, this go round. It's a really good takeaway. I don't know who will grab the reins. Yeah.
I'm optimistic that I think that we'll get
It's
there.
you, Scott. Start it, man. You're going to be the
Start
guy.
the movement.
That's right. That's right.
Dan, this has been really great.
Yeah. It was a fun talk.
Really cool to connect.
Likewise.
And I don't know if we'll be able to sort of track the discussion further, like in the comments section or something somewhere, but look forward to doing it again sometime.
Yeah.